All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are going to begin with a discussion of Kinot, selected Kinot, and a discussion of both the text and the meaning and some of the themes that come out from them. We're going to be led this morning, co-led by two different educators. We have Rabbi Daniel Reifman, who is the Rosh Kollel of the Drisha Summer Kollel and has taught Talmud and Halacha at Drisha for close to 20 years. He also teaches at the Pardes Institute for Jewish Studies and the Institute for Advanced Torah Studies at Bar-Ilan University during the year. And by Rabbanit Aliza Sperling, who is a teacher of Talmud at the Maharat Yeshiva Poetry Torah Beit Midrash program, the director of Her Torah, an women's Torah study and community program in Washington, D.C., who also serves as a faculty member for Wexner Fellowship and a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America.
Thank you very much, Michael. I wanted just to begin with a brief introduction about Kinot in general, a bit about Tisha B'Av this year, and what we're going to try to do today, this being our first virtual recitation / explanation of Kinot / discussion. In past years, I've often opened our recitation of Kinot by saying that Tisha B'Av is a hard day. Hard not only because of our physical discomfort, but also because usually it's a hard day for us to relate to. We're mourning the loss of the temple, but none of us has ever experienced the temple. The temple is a distant echo in the Jewish past. We read about extreme suffering and dislocation, but thankfully that's remote from most of our personal experiences. I think it's safe to say that this year, in this particular way, Tisha B'Av is not difficult at all. On the contrary, as we listen to the opening line of Echa, which we read last night, Echa yashva badad ha'ir rabat yam, how deserted lies the city once so full of people, it was hard not to look out the window and wonder how the text could be so contemporary when it's, of course, so ancient in origin. In a sense, this year, we have effectively been waiting for Tisha B'Av since Pesach. Pesach, of course, this year being a day when a time that should have been about community, about connection, about family, instead magnified our collective sense of loneliness. Tisha B'Av at least validates our sense of loneliness, of vulnerability. If it doesn't create a sense of community, at least it allows us to feel connected in that we are all mourning today. And when we think about the emptiness of our public spaces, it reminds us that there have been periods in our history when our public spaces have not been quite as vibrant as we remember them recently. For some of us, I think this Tisha B'Av will help us make meaning out of the predicament we find ourselves in. As we read through Kinot this morning, we will find various themes, various images to latch onto that may help us make sense of what we're all going through. And I think some of us may actually find that Tisha B'Av this year is more comforting than usual. We remember that God's hand is behind everything that happens to us. This is a theme that the Paitanim, that the poets of the various Kinot touch on again and again. And we may find, as we get closer to the end of the day, where of course the tone of the day shifts more towards the future redemption and not only on the tragedies of the past, we may find that we too are hoping for and yearning for a redemption that we can see maybe on the horizon. Some of us will not find that. For some of us, I think it's important to acknowledge that Tisha B'Av is even harder this year, that the pain of now is too real and too raw for us to emerge with anything as coherent as meaning. But I think what we can do at least is use Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av of any day of the year gives us a language, it gives us a context for talking about mourning, for talking about loneliness, for talking about loss. it makes it okay to feel that way and makes us understand that we're not alone, at least in terms of the scope of history. Tisha B'Av, of course, is the day that compresses our national mourning into one 24-hour period. And at least we can see ourselves as part of that history. The trials and travails of this year, of this circumstance, are not unique. We have faced this before, and we've come through as a people, despite all the hardship. The standard Ashkenazi Kinah collection, from which we'll be drawing this morning, consists of around 40 Kinot. We're obviously not going to get anywhere near that number. And I think there's been a shift in past years, whereas I think a generation or two ago, the practice was simply to mumble through all 40 Kinot with maybe not understanding them or reflecting on them so well. There's been a shift in the past generation or two, thanks in part to Rav Soloveitchik's efforts to make Tisha B'Av a more structured day, a day that involved Torah study, which is a little edgy, given that Torah study is one of the things that we're not supposed to engage in on Tisha B'Av, but Rav Soloveitchik nonetheless incorporated a great deal of Torah knowledge. And information in his presentation of Kinot, which he did year in and year out at the Maimonides School in Boston. There's been a shift toward doing more of a selection of Kinot and focusing on them more intensely so as to draw out more of the themes, to get more intimate with the Paitanim and with their experiences and the messages that they're trying to send us. Let's acknowledge, of course, that racing through difficult medieval poetry at breakneck speed is never easy, especially on a fast day, and therefore I think overall this tendency is a positive thing. What's even more interesting is in the past few years, I've noticed that this shorter selection of Kinot has coalesced into something like a canon, if I can share screen with you, I'll show you the excerpt that Karen put out this year from its Kinot, the Kinot that were put out with some of Rav Soloveitchik's commentary. They sent out this selection, and as I looked through it, I said, oh, I picked that one, and I would pick that one too. So apparently there's a growing degree of unanimity as to, or a growing degree of agreement as to which are the Kinot that we should be saying. We're going to do some Kinot this morning. We'll see how many that we have time for. Due to the dictates of Zoom, which don't allow us to do singing with any degree of, without a great degree of dissonance, or even chanting, what we're going to try to do is more close reading, more explanation, hopefully a little bit of chanting and a little bit of singing for those Kinot that have a standard tune toward them. Obviously, we would like this to be participatory to whatever extent possible. If you do have questions or comments, we welcome them. Please put them in the chat box. Aliza and I will try every so often to check the chat box and see if people have comments or questions. Okay, what is common to all of the traditions of Kinot, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and many other branches of Judaism as well, is that they begin with the poetry of Rebelliazer Rabbi Kalir, also known as Rebelliazer HaKalir, or even just Kalir. We know so little about him in terms of his biographical information that scholars can do no more than guess that he probably lived in the land of Israel at some point between the 6th and 8th centuries CE. The consensus now is to peg him late 6th or early 7th century, but we really have very, very little information. We are intimately familiar with Kalir, however, through his poetry. And the standard Ashkenazi Kinah collection begins with no less than 15 of Rabbi Elazar HaKalir's poems. We're going to read 3 this morning. 2 of them are more typical of a certain style of poetry that he, it's hard to say if he creates it, but he at least provides the baseline of the genre for this style of poetry. Very dense in terms of imagery, very dense in terms of its biblical references, which we'll talk about in a minute. but also very relatable. And the extent to which these poems have filtered through the years, of course, there are many more that did not survive that we don't have access to, but these we do, and the extent to which they filtered through the years, they've influenced hundreds and hundreds of years of Jewish poetry, and even, as we're going to see, modern Hebrew as well. The first poem, which is the first poem, the first Kinah, is the first, not only in the Ashkenazi tradition, but I believe in almost all of the Kinah traditions, is called Shavat Sur Mimeni Shimuni Ochrai. Is the text big enough to see? I just want to make sure that people can see. Yeah, okay. I don't want to enlarge it because then I lose the English, which I want people to have access to at the same time. The first thing to appreciate this poem is the unbelievable intricacy of the structure. If you notice, the poems are almost, except for the first word, are all alphabetically arranged, starting with the letter Samech, then the letter Ayin, Pei, Tzadi, and going on to the next page, going all the way through the end of the alphabet. That's child's play. Why are they an alphabetic acrostic? Because the first word of each line is taken from a corresponding chapter of the book of Eicha. So the word Suru is the first verse in, the first word in the Samech verse. The first 4 chapters of Eicha are, of course, themselves an alphabetic acrostic. So the word Suru is taken from the first word of the Samech verse of Perek Daled, chapter 4 of Eicha. The next 3 lines have their first words taken from the first words of the 3 Samech verses in chapter 3 of Eicha. The last line, Safku, is from chapter 2, and Kisila Kol Abirai is from chapter 1. Then, on top of that, the first word of each stanza, which is the only one doesn't match the alphabetic acrostic, is taken from the corresponding verse in the 5th chapter of Eicha. So we have essentially here a interweaving of all 5 chapters of Eicha according to the alphabetical structure, which he then uses as the platform to build his poem. You have to kind of stop and marvel at the absolute virtuosity that he uses in constructing this Kinah. Yes, the Eicha remix, so to speak. Thank you, Natalie. It must be said that, virtuosity aside, the structure somewhat limits the creativity of what he can say, because essentially, given that he's taking the first word of each of the chapters, he's locked into the general structure of the chapters of Eicha, which is, in general, an account of miserable and unremitting suffering, until you get to the end of the chapter where there's a call for remembrance and a call for vengeance against our enemies. And that's basically the way that the chapter proceeds. So let's just read through to give you a sense of how it would sound if we were chanting it together. Shavat Sur Mimeni Shimuni Ochrai, Sechi U'Maos Hasimuni Bedrei Chaverai, Sakota Mishkan Misachot Devirai, Sakota Vuvluku Gibarai, Safku Kaf Umadu Evarai, Kisila Kol Abirai. The language of Eicha really comes through here. He uses not only the words from Eicha itself, but a lot of other images that are both found in Eicha and other biblical passages. I just want to highlight a couple of interesting things that he does manage to do despite the constraints of the structure, which is, I think, what any good poet does, which is to create a sense of layering, that words taken in one context can be taken also in another context and acquire new meaning. And that's exactly what he does at the end of the next stanza. Nafla odeinu betzil dechuya, eini chikta lechazon ben berachya, ad pilei gilgal chavuya, eini me'olet bivanit nechuya, Asa v'nicham v'ikral libchia v'nam al eile ani bochia. This last phrase, eile ani bochia, is taken, of course, from Eicha, from the first chapter of Eicha. But if you notice here, whereas in Eicha itself, it seems that it's the narrator crying out about the tragedies that have befallen Israel, here the Paitan, Kabir, puts it in the mouth of God. He says he acted first and later regretted. Asav v'nicham, calling others to tears. God calls others to mourn over that which he had punished us. Now it's God who's saying, I am crying out over the losses that Israel has suffered. We'll just continue through another 2 verses. פחד החית שילה תחב סודיה, פתו חזירי יערי חסידיה, פצו מעשה ערווה לנידיה, פרסת ציון בידיה. על הר צדו שעוני מדני, צפו ראש זדוני, צמתו בנוב לעמוד זדוני, צוד נצרת לעורר מדני, צעקה בימי בן דיני, צדיקו אדוני. There's one line in this last stanza, Tzamtu benov la'amod zedonai, which literally translates as, they stopped in Nov to stand against my iniquities. Okay, it's a rough translation. The precise translation here is a little tricky, given that he's layering so many words and so many images on top of each other. But if you focus here on the middle, the middle 2 words, benov la'amod, if you like I were forced in high school to memorize parts of chapters 10 and 11 of Yoshiyahu, you would immediately pick this out from the verse in Yoshiyahu, which says, Od hayom benov la'amod, which is the beginning of the Haftarah that we read in outside land of Israel on the 8th day of Pesach. In Israel, we read it on Yom HaTzmaut. Which is, of course, the piyut that speaks about the end of days and the miraculous coming of redemption, period in time when v'garz even keves v'namerim k'dir bats, when the lion lie down with the lamb, etc., etc. That whole image, that whole series of images about the Messianic era begins with this image of God standing on the site of Nov being a town near Jerusalem, and calling out and toward Jerusalem, which he's about to redeem. Here the image is reversed. It's the enemies who are standing at Nov, about to go punish Israel. Why Nov, of all places, aside from the fact that it's mentioned in the Navi, and he has this image of Nov la'amod, somebody standing in Nov, because Nov is, of course, the site of a terrible massacre. The murderous sin of Nov, who commits the massacre of the Kohanim who lived in Nov. Shaul, or Shaul's henchman, in chasing after David. David finds refuge in the city of priests of Nov, who feed him and clothe him and send him on his way. And then Shaul's henchmen come, find the Kohanim have given David refuge, and massacre them all. Essentially, what we have here is a reminder that, as terrible as the tragedies that have befallen us are, they're not always unjustified. We've committed many sins, and sometimes we're being punished for those sins. You are not the first, the Paitan is essentially saying, who have massacred Kohanim and destroyed those engaged in God's holy work. And therefore, it's especially fitting that he puts this image in this verse, which ends, Tzadikhu Adonai, that God is righteous, because God, of course, sometimes punishes us for things in a way that we deserve. Okay. There's more to talk about in this very rich piyut, but I do want to move on because time is short, and there's a lot of very rich poetry that I do want to get to. So I actually want to take a minute here to shift to a poem a Kinah that's not in this packet, but I photocopied the pages for you from the current Kinah book. This is another poem by Kalir, one of my favorites actually, in the sense that one can have a favorite Kinah. Another highly intricate poem in terms of its structure. There's a triple alphabetic acrostic, or a half alphabetic acrostic, in the first 3 lines. After the initial letter Aleph, we have 3 Alephs, 3 Bets, 3 Gimels, all the way through, this got cut off a little bit, all the way through Lamed. And then in the last line of the poem, following the Aleph, we have a reverse half alphabetic acrostic, starting with Taf all the way through Mem. And to top it all off, he structures it according to, or tacks on at the end of every verse, at the end of every stanza, a verse from the Torah that begins with the word me. So this is an interesting point that struck me last night when we were reading Eicha. One of the things that Eicha does, grammatically speaking, is it introduces us to the idea that rhetorical questions are an essential vehicle of relating to or speaking about suffering. When you can't describe something in a declarative sentence, when it's too awful to talk about, you ask a rhetorical question. How can this be? How can it be that Jerusalem is so desolate? How can it be that we are suffering so much? And therefore, this piyut, this kinah, takes that same device, harnessing the rhetorical questions that begin with the word me. Me, of course, means who, but can also be a more general introduction to a rhetorical question in biblical Hebrew, using this series of verses as a way to talk about suffering. The fact that every line opens with an aleph preceding the acrostic letter means that it does an interesting thing to the poem, because it means that the poem is narrated mostly in first person, actually quite intensely in first person. Because aleph, of course, introduces the first person future tense or imperfect, and therefore it's very much about the narrator, the narrator's perspective. And because it's imperfect, it's what the narrator is hoping or wishing will happen. And therefore, what we find in this kinah is that the narrator uses this device to kind of break out of where he is physically or experientially and hope for or wish for all of these things that are going to help him in his predicament. Beginning with the first verse, I let my lament soar to heaven. But actually, the literal translation of A'adeh is I soar to heaven. Think of this image of the suffering subject imagining himself flying up to heaven. There's an escape. There's a desire to escape his current predicament, but not completely, because where is he going? To heaven. Why? Inviting heaven itself to join in my lament. He's going to heaven to get God and the heavenly host to join him in his lament to make it more effective. And therefore he says, I curse this day that twice destroyed me, and grieve, would that my head were water, mi'itein roshi mayim, a verse that we read this morning in the Haftarah from Yirmiyahu. What does it mean that if my head were water? Yirmiyahu is saying, if only my head were made of water, I would have enough tears to adequately mourn all that my people had suffered. And this, of course, in a period long before the temple had been destroyed. Again, in the next, this notion of trying to recruit God or the heavenly host to join him in mourning can, of course, seem highly oxymoronic, given, of course, that it's God who we assume is punishing us. And yet, this is a very prominent theme throughout Midrashic literature on Eicha and other areas where the Midrash talks about Jewish suffering, that God suffers with us, that God goes into exile with us. And therefore, this is actually a piece of all of that Midrashic tradition that talks about God joining us in our mourning. And again, we see it here in the third stanza, which we'll do out of order. Egva ve'enashel kenokef zayit, agare bikol b'nei bayit, egrom she'omar ba'al habayit, erashem yitineni shamir v'shayit. What is the bayit here? What is the house? And who is the Baal Habayit, the master of the house? The house is, of course, the heaven. The Baal Bayit is God. And it's God who's joining him not only in mourning, but now, Mitineni Shamir Vashayid. Here he takes a verse from Yoshiyahu, where God is saying, even if I have no weapons to punish Israel's enemies, give me Shamir Vashayid, thorns and thistles, and I will attack Israel's enemies with them. And this is a theme that continues throughout this kinah of wanting God to participate in, or at least to hear, the mourning and lamenting that the Mekonim, the narrator, is doing here. This is an interesting point also to reflect on as we think more generally about mourning and how we experience mourning and how we use mourning as a cathartic device. Somebody who is in the midst of suffering sometimes wants nothing more than for somebody to acknowledge that suffering, and especially for an authority figure to acknowledge that suffering. And over again, Kalir uses these me verses as a way of saying, all we want is for God to register the fact that we're suffering, for us to be heard, for us to be acknowledged. Here in this verse, mi tain efovi katfun milai, would that my words were written into record. Mi tain li shomea li, would that I had someone to give me hearing. All he wants is somebody to listen to him. All he wants is somebody to write down what he's experiencing. These last two verses, of course, taken from the book of Eov, was, of course, the paradigm of the suffering subject who turns to God and says, hey, what's up? There's also a repetition of the theme of escape that we saw in the first word, of flying up. This is more in the second half of the poem, where again in these me verses, mi tain li ever kayona, if I had the wings of a dove, he could fly away. Mi ovileni ir matzor, who would take me away to a walled city where it would be safe. This is something that the Mekonim, that the narrator who's lamenting here, says over and over. He wants to be out of this circumstance, and he's using the device of this lament as a way of imagining himself being somewhere else. There is, however, one more theme that I just want to touch on. I didn't, in looking at all the various commentary on this poem, I didn't actually see it articulated anywhere, but it struck me as I was reading through it. The running throughout this poem is kind of an undercurrent here, imagery taken from Shir HaShirim, from Song of Songs. And this starts really in the second stanza. Avchin bivchi yelel midbar, evchanalel milel midbar midbar, avakeiti olat midbar, eshagni teneni bamidbar. Of course, every line here ends with midbar, the wilderness. And in the first line, when he talks about Yilel Midbar, the wailing in the desert, he's referring, of course, to the wailing that the Israelites do on the night after the scouts come back from the land of Israel and report that the land of Israel is unconquerable, and they mourn. And the Midrash, of course, weighs in at that point and says, you're mourning now, I will give you something to mourn about, and identifies that day as the 9th of Av. The Midbar, of course, is a very rich and multivocal or multivocal image in Jewish tradition. The Midbar is, on one hand, a place of suffering, a place of desolation. On the other hand, is a place that has very positive associations, given that it's where Israel and God consummate their relationship in the giving of the Torah and then the 40 years in the desert. There's one phrase here at the end, Olat Midbar. Who is the Olat Midbar, who comes from the desert, who comes from the wilderness? This is a phrase taken from Shir HaShirim. Mizot Ola min HaMidbar, the lover says, as her beloved is coming, and she sees the plume of dust rising from the desert as he's getting closer to Jerusalem. And again, as the poem continues, you see a couple of phrases taken from Shir HaShirim kind of slipped in here and there. In this fourth verse, Ed agro evelo emtsaehu, I will search for the shepherd and will not find him, again, is taken directly from Shir HaShirim, where the beloved is described as ro'eh ben hashoshanim. And of course, one of the main themes of Shir HaShirim is the two lovers searching for each other and not always being able to find each other. And then, of course, that's brought to a head in the penultimate stanza in the Kinah. Ekof lecha rosh cheli, echra lecha berch lechater mechli, ach tircha b'shir mishirei mecholi, achavein mitencha ke'achli. Mitencha ke'achli is taken from Shir HaShirim. Would that you would be like a brother to me, but brother more in the sense of a lover. Turning to God and saying, we want a more positive relationship with you. We want to return to you. And the Kinah ends really on that note, where after relaying all of this suffering and all of this lament, in the third to last stanza, which is the only stanza not to end with a me verse, but rather a ki verse, ki yad Adonai astazot, we remind ourselves that really God is behind all of this, that there is a divine plan, even if we can't always see it. And therefore, in the last two stanzas rather, the narrator turns to God and says, I will submit myself to you. I want you to heal me. And then in the last verse, Al tishkach tza'akat Ariel, elav legor Yudav Yisrael, alfei shinan asher masar el lemor mitein mitzion Yeshuo Yisrael. Ending, of course, on the note of redemption, that ultimately, even if we ask mitein mitzion Yeshuo Yisrael, who would deliver us, we know eventually that the deliverance will come and that it will come from God. Okay, Aliza Sperling is going to take us now to, I don't have my list in front of me. I think the next one in the packet is number 11, which again is the third kaliyah that we're going to say, Vayikonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I just wanted to say before I start talking about this Kinah, that in your introduction, when you were talking about how difficult this year is, that really resonated with me. It's a really difficult year to say, I've been in such despair, our world has been in such despair for such a long time, and now let me enter into a day of yet more despair. And I think that I had more than my usual apprehension about Tisha B'Av this year. What would it be like to enter into a day that's full of despair? And I think it's interesting. You are almost at the end of your Tisha B'Av, Daniel, in Israel, but we are kind of at the beginning. And I was really scared of reading Eicha this year, and in some ways it was actually very nourishing. So I'm interested to just kind of experience this with all of you and see where it takes us. This Kinah number 11, Vayikonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu, describes a shattering event in the life of the nation, the death of King Yoshiyahu. And I guess the thing that maybe we could compare it to is, people say, people would say, where were you when you heard that JFK was killed, or where were you when the towers came down, right? It was this kind of shattering event for the people when King Yoshiyahu was killed by Parul. Now, who is this King Yoshiyahu? So if you go back to Malachim and Divrei Yamim, you know that Yoshiyahu is the grandson of the wicked King Menashe, who brings idolatry into his kingdom after his father Chizkiyahu did all the right things, and then his son Ammon follows in his wicked ways. And then we come to Yoshiyahu. Yoshiyahu is Ammon's son, and he becomes king when he is only 8 years old. And we don't know what's going to be with him. I'm going to embarrass Orly and say she's 9. So he was 8. Okay. And the 18th year of Yoshiyahu's reign, they are doing a bedek habayit. They are trying to improve the Beit HaMikdash, the grounds of the Beit HaMikdash. And in the very famous story, they find a Sefer Torah. They find either a full Sefer Torah or maybe just part of a Sefer Torah open to the Tochacha, to the curses in Devarim. And they find it in the Beit HaMikdash. They bring it to Yoshiyahu. They read it to him. And when he hears these words, he's completely transformed, and he embarks on this cleansing of the kingdom, of trying to get rid of all the idolatry, to bring back the worship of God. And Yoshiyahu, actually, our tradition is that Yoshiyahu's Rabbi is Chilkiah, Yirmiyahu's father. And Yoshiyahu tries to bring the spiritual renaissance of the kingdom. And it seems to be pretty successful. And Yirmiyahu, the prophet during this time, is so excited and so hopeful in some ways, right? Maybe there will be some change that's going to happen to the people. And so there are 13 years of this spiritual renaissance, this spiritual cleansing. And then the year 31 of Yoshiyahu's reign, Parul of Egypt asks for permission to travel through the kingdom of Judah so that he can fight against Assyria. And Yirmiyahu counsels Yoshiyahu to allow Parul to go through the kingdom, but Yoshiyahu is very firm that he will not allow him to go through. And so Parul decides he's going through anyway, and so they meet at this battle of Megiddo, and Yoshiyahu is killed. And there are descriptions of the terrible way in which he's killed. His body is punctured like a sieve. And it's this terrible tragedy for the Jewish people. And the question really is, why didn't Yoshiyahu just allow Parul to go through the land? And the Gemara in Ta'anit gives us an answer. The Gemara in Ta'anit basically says that Yirmiyahu and Yoshiyahu are having this discussion, about whether they should allow Parul to travel through the land. And Yoshiyahu is so confident in the reforms that he's brought about in the land that he believes that the blessing that Charav lo ta'avor b'artzacha, the sword shall not go through your land, will come true. Now, it's not a sword that's directed at them, right? But it's just a sword. But he is so confident in the spiritual revival that he's brought about that he believes that nothing will happen to them. And so right, ultimately we see that he's proved wrong, and Parul comes through and he's killed at Megiddo. And this brings to the people, right? It's like this terrible tragedy for everyone. It's a tragedy on a national scale. It's a tragedy on a religious scale. They don't know what to do with themselves, right? It's funny because in so many ways, Yoshiyahu has kind of vanished from our, our national pantheon of heroes, but really, he should be there. And who knows what could have happened if he wouldn't have been killed at Megiddo, and he would have been able to continue. Yes, Josiah. And so I just want to show you a couple of sources. Right, and so they say, why was he so confident, right? If the people really had this kind of religious revival, then why didn't God protect them? And there's this very interesting source in Eicha Rabbah 1:18, where it says, Yoshiyahu did not know that his entire generation worshipped idols. What did the scoffers of his generation do? They would put half of the idolatrous form on one door and half on the other door. Yoshiyahu would send 2 Talmidei Chachamim, wise men, to purge their homes from idols, or to inspect, I guess. They would enter but find nothing. As they left, the people would then close the door so that on the inside the idols would be reattached. It's really interesting, evocative midrash of what's going on. And it really makes you think about the power of an individual to affect change, right? On the one hand, we have Yoshiyahu, who makes these sweeping changes, and Yirmiyahu is so excited about them, and it seems like maybe something's going to happen, and you see the incredible power of the individual, especially an individual with power. But on the other hand, right, the question is, what kind of change can you bring about on the inside, in people's homes, right? And that kind of change is much more difficult. And so I think it invites us to think about, as we're trying to make change in our own societies, right? What are the kinds of changes that come from the outside, right? And what kind of impact do they have? And how do we help people make change on the inside, right? How do we help people on their own take apart whatever idols they have in their own homes, the things that they're that we believe they could be doing better, right? And help them so that on the inside, they're also trying to make those changes. Now, as I said, this tragedy, this unbelievable tragedy for the people, really struck them hard. And as Yael Ziegler says, this was not only a national tragedy, right? Yoshiyahu was the last righteous king before the destruction. but it also brought about these questions about, why did bad things happen to good people? That later on we're going to see in the Churban and the destruction of the temple itself. But the people started confronting this question here with the death of Yoshiyahu. So in the Gemara, and Kalir also has it in our Kinah. So Daniel, if you could just go to the next page. Okay. All right, first of all, the line that starts with Mem, Mechatot stirat mizuzot, chazon antuti hechelu levazot, because they worshipped idols behind closed doors and scorned the vision of the prophet from Anatot. So this line, because they worshipped idols behind closed doors, is a reference to this Midrash about the people coming in and inspecting and not finding the idols behind the doors. It's interesting, I believe that it was Ibn Ezra who criticized Kalir for some of his poems, that you really have to know a lot of Midrash in order to understand Kalir's poetry. And then if we go down a little bit, you see this question of theodicy, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? So they come to, this is where it starts with Kuf. Kalim Satatu Acharav Ezon Motzaf Bihu. I'm going to read it actually from mine because I can't read the screen. Ve'ad mitzoy nefesh ma'asav hefihu. Ruach sfatav hiptza mipihu. Tzadiku Adonai ki mariti fihu. So this is when Yoshiyahu is dying. Swiftly they drew near to hear his last words. His deeds remained beautiful even as he expired. With his last gasp, he mumbled, "The Lord is righteous. It is I who defied his word." So again, within this Kinah, trying to find an answer to why do bad things happen to good people? Why did this terrible tragedy happen when Yoshiyahu was such a wonderful king, right? So maybe it's because we, even on the outside, it looked like we were doing better, and the inside we weren't. And we have Yoshiyahu himself giving Tziduk Hadin, saying that this is all righteous. This was all just. Finally, just to point out, this is a eulogy, a lamentation for the death of Yoshiyahu. According to our tradition, Perek Daled of Eicha is also a lamentation over the death of Yoshiyahu. And so you see the first word of this Kinah, of each of the lines of this Kinah, echoes the first word of each of the lines of Perek Daled. So for instance, Eicha Eli Konenu Me'elav, right? In Perek Daled we have Eicha Yuam Zahav. Then we have B'nei Cham Avram. In Perek Daled we have B'nei Tzion HaYikarim, right? Gam B'chol HaMalachim. In Perek Daled we have Gam Tanim Chatzushet. So again, right, we have this going back and forth between Perek Daled and Kinah Yud Aleph. Our tradition is that because Yirmiyahu said these 22 lines of Hesped and Lamentations for Yoshiyahu, so as a reward for that, there were 22 years between the death of Yoshiyahu and the Churban of the first temple. So let's say this to ourselves, and then we'll go on to 16.
I'll read it out loud for those who want to read along. Vayikaren Yirmiyahu el Yoshiyahu, Eicha Eli Konenu Me'elav, Ben Shmona Shana Heichel Lidosh Me'elav, Ben Yecham Be'avram, Heichel Echanu Alav, L'huzkar lo Shibui Mifalav. Gam B'chol HaMelachim Asher Kamu Ligdor, Lo Kam Kamo Mimot Avigdor, Davak Bo Avon Litzanei Hador, Asher Achar Hadelet Kamu Lisdor. האוכלים זרע שיחור, כתמו הטוב פי חמו משחור, ויגדל עוון והשיב ימין אחור, ועוד לא שלח ידו מן החור. זעקו המערב כנמדת להקים, ביצע אמרתו בעבור אשר לא יקים, חשך תערו כניעצו רחוקים, בבית עמו עשי דעת וחוקים. טובים רעים נקראו כשלחו מלאך, מעליב הלך היום לטלח, Yedei am haaretz damim b'malach te'anesh b'vitzi et pnei filach. Kinah hamonai lelechet aram naharayim leman lo talvor cherev kol shehu be'Ephraim lo shama lechozer lashuv achorayim ki gzera nigzera lasechsech b'mitzrayim b'mitzrayim. Mechatot stirat mezuzot chazon anatot echelu levazot nanua namim lechumo lehavzot v'lo yisev panav v'saftu azot suru heidu ad lo shi'a v'yimanusu mat yisod nishi'a pnei karav v'lo alta lo shi'a v'yoru hayorim lamelech Yoshiyahu Odenu otzei meinav b'gevyor no chatzim chetz achar chetz marim v'lo chatzim Tzadu v'samuhu k'matara lachitzim v'yizruku bo shlosh meot chitzim. It's an interesting image here that it says they ambushed him and made him their target. They made him like a target for shooting practice, pelting him with 300 arrows, according to the Midrash. Kalim tzatzu acharav ezon motzav fihu v'ad mitzui nefesh masav hefihu Ras tevatav hiftzam ipihu tzadik Adonai ki mariti fihu Sisinov ki kano za'am l'shalem shonam ba'avon bitzam Tam ketematov amzu b'fash'am v'yikonen alav kolecha yuam zahav Tam b'mikre chadkos megido lishtot b'mo'ed shnat shmita kegal hakel le'etot Talasim ushtayim meharos shatot ki tzaftu lo echa b'asim ushtayim otot. Okay, we'll now go on to the next Kinah that we're going to say together, which is Kinah number 16. Again, this is, I think, the last Kinah from Kalir that we're going to say together, and relates to other Midrashim that are found regarding the period of the Churban.
So we are now going from the first temple to the second temple, and this Kinah presents us these allusions to these terrible stories about what happened at the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. We learn about Titus, Roman Titus, who comes in and defiles the Beit HaMikdash in ways that nobody could have comprehended. We who were so used to the sanctity of the Beit HaMikdash, to the fact that nobody could come into the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, except the high priest, only on Yom Kippur, and even then we were so scared what will happen to the Kohen Gadol. Titus enters into the Kodesh HaKodashim, takes a Sefer Torah, takes a prostitute, and he engages in terrible acts in the Kodesh HaKodashim on the Sefer Torah. And people are hearing about this, looking at this, and just asking, how could this happen? How could this happen to us? And I wanna take this. We could just go back to the Kinah. Okay. So if you see here, right, it tells us Chor Dasher Satzar Bifnim Shalaf Charbo Uva Lifnai Lifnim comes into the Kodesh HaKodashim. Nachalatenu Bi'ed Kiti Melecham Hapanim. Don't know if you could just move the little, yeah. Right? He comes into this most sanctified of places, the place that we consider to be our holiest. How is it that this wicked person was able to defile the place that was the holiest, that was the most valuable and beloved to all of us? And as the Kinot goes on, it describes, right, how this dissonance that the people experienced, right? We know from tradition, right? We know that when the sons of Aaron come in and bring offerings that they shouldn't have brought, even with the best of intentions, fire comes down and takes them. And yet look at these people who are able to enter into the Beit HaMikdash to do all these terrible things, right? How could it be? How could it be that we know one thing from our tradition, and then with our own eyes we're witnessing these other terrible things. And I want to take us from this Kinah to a very different source, a book that I read recently called To the Edge of Sorrow by Aaron Appelfeld, where he talks about the Shoah. And he talks about a group of partisan fighters who are in Ukraine, and they're Jewish partisan fighters. They have all witnessed terrible things that have happened to their families, that have happened to their villages, to their friends. And the few of them are able to make their way up onto the top of the mountain and come together. And they go. They're hopeful that they will be able to bomb the train tracks that are bringing Jews to the concentration camps. And what's interesting, one of the things that's really interesting about this book is that these Jews do not really have any connection to Jewish tradition. Their parents rejected it. They were not brought up with any tradition at all, right? As opposed to in this Kinah, where they're so enmeshed in the tradition, right? They have such expectations of what will happen to them, and they can't believe what they're seeing in front of them. In this novel, right, they don't have any real connection to Jewish tradition. But by seeing what's going on in front of them, all the atrocities, all the terrible things that are happening, some of them, not all of them, actually come closer to Jewish tradition. And I'd like to read with you an excerpt from this book that I think is an interesting countertext to this Kinah by Kalir. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, so this is from chapter 19. So Camille is the commander of these partisans, these Jewish partisans up on the mountain. And even though Camille comes from no Jewish tradition, he starts, as he's leading them, he starts to say things that really make people wonder, right? Because he's talking about the tradition of our forefathers, and that we need to come close to that. And another thing that's interesting before we get to this is that when the partisans go down to the village to make raids so that they can get food, actually the most important thing for them is when they're able to find books. And they bring the books back onto the top of the mountain, and they start to read from these books. And these books that had not really meant anything to them before, Jewish books, all of a sudden get great meaning for them. So here it is from To the Edge of Sorrow. All of a sudden, the Spirit came over Camille, and he spoke about our forefathers and the God of our forefathers with whom we must connect. Denial had eroded our best qualities, Camille said, and we had reached rock bottom. We couldn't believe our ears. He didn't sound like the commander who had led us through hostile forests and strangling swamps, but like a spiritual leader flooded with faith. The veteran fighters do not think as Camille does. A thin trail of fog always accompanies his words, but there are people who interpret his state of mind as wings that propel his bold actions. Now he is talking more and more about denial, alienation, abandoning the well springs of life, international movements that eat us up inside. Without our forefathers and the God of our forefathers, our lives hang by a thread. This tall and powerful man who leads his soldiers in daring raids, who knows the map of this region like the palm of his hand, is transformed at night when he is joined to words and phrases whose sounds frighten us. Several fighters ran out of patience, and one shouted at him, "You want to do the impossible. The connection with the ancestral God has been broken once and for all. You can't connect what can't be connected. This is not a time for mystical delusions. Yes, we have been mortally wounded, and the pain is enormous, but we will not bandage the wounds with false bandages. We need iodine to disinfect the wounds, not whispered words." Camille did not respond. He sat leaning on his hands, hearing the accusations as if baring his back to the whip. There was no one that night lonelier than he. For a moment it seemed as though he was about to break down, lay his weapon on the ground, and say, "I can see that my faith is not to your liking. I have no desire to argue. There is no point in arguing about faith. If you lack confidence in me, it's best I leave, go on my way into my fate, and you do what your heart tells you to do." Instead, he did not utter a sound. And when I think about this Kinah number 16, of people seeing what seems to be so disconnected from what they knew, in some ways, I really see these same words. In some ways, when we saw this, there was no one lonelier than us, right? When we saw what God had done, had allowed Titus and the Romans to do to the Beit HaMikdash, to the Kodesh HaKodeshim, there was no one lonelier. We hear the accusations as if bearing our backs to the whip. We do not utter a sound. We don't know what to make of this terrible disconnect, this terrible dissonance between what we believe and what we see. And this Kinah really lays it out for us in ways where we can't even bear to say the words of what happens to us at the time of the Churban. I do think, Daniel, if you could put the Kinah back up. Thank you. And then if we can just go down to the next page. Thank you. So we have these different images of destruction and dissonance. And then at the end of the Kinah, here we go, where it says, Ata katzafta of Yoshiyahu lefanot. So it tells the story of these children who were taken captive, and they were sent on ships to Rome. So, children, young people, and they were sent on ships, and they all knew what they were going to be sent for, and they were going to be sent for prostitution or other sexual violence, and they don't know what to do. And so they're on these ships, and they try to figure out, what is our next move here? What should we do? And so the Gemara actually tells us the discussion that they had. Now we'll go back to my screen share. Okay, so this is in Gittin 57b, and I'll read it, I guess, in English. Rabbi Huda says that Shmuel says, and some say that it was Rabbi Ami who says this, and some say that it was done in a Baraita. There is an incident involving 400 boys and girls who were taken as captives for the purpose of prostitution. These children sensed on their own what they were expected to do, and they said, if we commit suicide and drown in the sea, will we come to eternal life in the world to come? Right, this was their question, right? The oldest child among them expounded the verse. The Lord said, I will bring back from Bashan, I will bring them back from the depths of the sea. I will bring back from Bashan, from between the teeth, being Shane of the lion, and I will bring them back from the depths of the sea, is referring to those who drown in the sea for the sake of heaven. In other words, yes, you will get Olam Haba, you will get the world to come. When the girls heard this, they all leapt and fell into the sea. The boys then draw a kal vachomer inference, because we're still Jews, with regard to themselves, and said, if these girls for whom sexual intercourse with men is their natural way act in such a manner, then we for whom it is not our natural way, all the more so. And they too leapt into the sea. Concerning them, the verse states, as for your sake, we are killed all the day long. We are reckoned as sheep for the slaughter. And the end of this Kinah talks about this story, right? The Kalir is making reference to this story here. And I was thinking about the difference between the beginning of the Kinah and the end of the Kinah, because the beginning of the Kinah deals with people who may have had, the Churban comes and it's such a terrible thing, but they've had a lifetime of experiences and they're experiencing this dissonance. But these are children, these are young people, and maybe their whole life really was caught up with fighting against the Romans, right? Where they didn't feel like they were such a special people, right? And for them to not have those things except as memories transmitted from their children to give to them, and yet still be able to take these actions, right? That's an amazing thing, right? Where they are able to take these brave, courageous actions for the sake of a God where they didn't experience all the good things of the temple. They didn't experience God in their lives, probably, mostly in a good way, and that they're still able to take this action. And it reminds me of the end, well, later on in this story, there's one little boy who's with this group of Jewish partisans, and they all take care of him, and they try to kind of shield him from what's going on. And he's really their light. And here it goes. Michael copied out a song. This is the boy that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Bertitchev used to sing to himself. Like these people are not connected to tradition, so this is new to them. At night, after distributing the pages to the study group, he was asked to read it. Michael was self-conscious, but Maxie, his tutor, who stood beside him, encouraged him, and he read. And it's just an amazing thing to hear somebody during the Shoah up on the mountain, because his family has been decimated, read these words. Wherever I go, you. Wherever I stand, you. Only you. Again, you. Always you. If I feel good, you. If I feel bad, you. Only you. Again, you. Always you. Sky, you. Earth, you. Up, you. Down, you. I look thus, I see this. Only you, again you, always you. You, you, you. Coming from Michael's lips, the poem sounded as if it were written for him. The sharper minds among us who were about to pounce and dissect it fell silent at once, and all were filled with wonder and emotion. With every passing minute, it became harder to hold back our tears. Okay. Now let's read together Kinah 16.
If it's okay, I don't actually want to read through the entire Kinah. Maybe we'll read through the last few verses about the Midrash of the children, if only because time is a bit short. Ata katzafte v'irsheta lefanot, yiladim asher ein bahem kol ma'um misham lehipanot. Lama ragshu goyim below sha'ata ela mincha pinot, v'shilchum le'eretz utz b'shalosh sefinot. השיבנו שיבו כבאו בנבחי ים ושיתפו עצמם נחלים פה בים שיר ותשבחות שרו כעל ים כעליך הרגנו במצולות ים כי תומות בעד נפשן כל זאת בעתנו לשכחנוך חילול לממשן תקוותם נתנו למשיב מבשן ובת כל נשמע ורע למה תישן. One of the themes that comes out of this last Kinah is the theme of martyrdom, and Max noted in the chat column that this raises a particularly difficult theme for those who have suffered with thoughts of suicide or have suffered sexual abuse. The suffering we recount on Tisha B'Av is real and can be difficult for those for whom this is not such a distant personal experience. Take that as a kind of trigger warning, if you will. But I do mean it seriously, because in the next two Kinot especially, we confront this idea of martyrdom head on. It becomes an important theme, especially as we get closer to the Middle Ages. The Kinot arranged, of course, in chronological order, although that's not true with all the Kinot collections. It's true specifically with the Ashkenazi Kinot collection, but other Kinot collections arrange them differently. We move now into Kinot that were written in the Middle Ages, based again in part on Midrashim, similar to the Midrashim that undergirded the previous Kinah. The next one, which I don't want to go to in too much depth, I think it's one of the ones that we're most familiar with because we say a different version of this Kinah on Yom Kippur, is Arzeh Levanon Adirei HaTorah, which is about the Asara Harugei Malchut, the 10 martyrs of the period of following the destruction of the temple, during the Roman persecutions, and especially in the time of Bar Kokhba, in the rebellion that was put down by Hadrian. We'll just read through the first verse together. Arzeh Levanon Adirei HaTorah, Baalei Trisin b'Mishna u'Vigmara, Giborei Koach Amalei Bitara, Damam Nishpach Kamayim v'Nashta Gvura, Hinam Kedoshei Harugei Malchut Asara, V'Yalei Ani Bochia V'Ani Nigra. Using, of course, some of the imagery from Echa, Al Elani Bochia. For example, this Paitan, who is Rabbi Meir ben Yechiel from Germany in the 13th century, takes what had by that point become an established tradition of the 10 martyrs who were killed by Hadrian, or at least in that general time period, and turns it into a narrative. This narrative is actually not quite as rich as the one that we read, or at least Ashkenazim read in the Musaf service on Yom Kippur, which gives even more information and more details about how they're chosen to be killed and what they do and how they accept the judgment upon themselves. But the idea of martyrdom becomes a central idea during this period in history. And as the legend of these 10 martyrs develops over time, it becomes the source for many different communities or traditions that upheld martyrdom as something laudatory, as something praiseworthy. To take just for a moment to take a more critical eye to this tradition, again, as I said, the 10 martyr tradition was already well established even by the Gaonic period, so we're talking even before the Middle Ages. But if you look at the figures who are mentioned in this Kinah, we have some historical information about them. Some of them didn't even live at the same time period, to say nothing of being of meeting their demise at the same time period. So this is clearly a later reworking of earlier historical material, giving it a narrative frame, bringing together many different prominent rabbis from this period and talking about how they all suffered the same fate of martyrdom, even if in historical fact we know that they may have suffered martyrdom, but it wasn't at the same hand or at the same time. Another thing that draws these 10 figures together is their interest in mysticism, and there's a heavy dose of mysticism involved in the story. It's told about how the Roman emperor declares they have to all be killed, and they said, we will accept this judgment upon ourselves as soon as we check with the forces in heaven. And they do a mystical rite, and one of them goes up to heaven and hears that, yes, this has been fated to happen, and they accept judgment upon themselves. So that's significant, first of all, in the fact that there is this kind of mystical dimension to this, that God has declared this upon them, and in most of the different traditions of this narrative, there's no justification for it, aside from a very loose sense of, in some traditions, it's the fact that there are 10 rabbis and there are 10 brothers of Joseph who sold him into slavery, and therefore they're paying the price for the sin that was committed by Joseph's brothers. But aside from that, the sense of justice here is very loose, if present at all. But also because it gives a certain, it gives the narrative a certain kind of character of being mystically informed, giving another dimension that is kind of trans-historical or of history that relates to the death of these 10 martyrs. Where it comes into play, in especially prominent fashion, is the next Kinah that we're going to look at and read through a little more of. Hacharishu mimeni v'adabeira. Hacharishu mimeni v'adabeira is one of a number of Kinot that are in the standard Kinah collection that relate to the Crusades or other massacres that happened in Europe in the High Middle Ages, particularly in Germany and France, and also a little later on in Spain. We don't know who the author of this particular Kinah was, nor are we 100% certain which massacre it refers to, but unfortunately, beginning with the First Crusade in 1096 and through the next couple hundred years, there is no shortage of massacres to choose from. Some references I saw, some editions I saw say this refers to the massacre in Mainz during the actual First Crusade. So let's just read through the first stanza, and then we'll talk a little more about the style. Hacharishu mimeni v'adabeira v'yavor alai ma chamas azak v'shol lecha shochein shamayma hetzikatni ruchi v'lucha ledoma keoleda efa eshaf v'eshoma misped mar e'eseh v'akonein binhima divrei shagota yitchu kayama sifdi aladati asher nitna leshama arid b'sichi v'ahima v'kol nehi arima. really very little of substance happens in this, or is discussed in this first stanza. It's really just the narrator saying over and over again how he's going to scream out, how he's going to cry out, and he ends with 2 biblical verses. I read B'sichi ve'ahima v'kol mihi arima, which end every subsequent stanza. The style here, if you can tell, is certainly looser than, the structure is definitely looser, certainly than the very tightly woven and tightly structured piyutim that we read before by Kalir. And the sense that you get from this Kinah is that it's much more raw and much more real. There are points in the Kinah, in fact, where he just simply cries out here towards the end, Oy vavoy shoed vashever lano tarim. There's nothing to say except to just cry out in anguish, because it's likely that whoever wrote this Kinah actually witnessed or had firsthand testimony of the terrible tragedies that befell the communities of the Rhone Valley or elsewhere in Europe during this period. That were really very brutal, very bloody, and very frightening. Jews had lived in Europe, after all, for many hundreds of years in relative safety. They were highly dependent on their Christian neighbors and Christian authorities for their well-being and for their physical well-being and their safety. What snapped in 1096 as mobs moved through the Rhone Valley and massacred several Jewish communities there was really a breach of that sense of safety. And all of a sudden the Jews realized they couldn't rely on the Christian authorities to save them. And that was entirely disorienting, even if the losses were not necessarily as great as some of the sources make them out to be. So this Kinah is really coming from a place of very close to the event itself, as opposed to Kalir and some of the other piyutim that we read, which are coming several hundred years after the events they describe. And therefore the imagery here is really very raw. And the structure as well. It often seems sometimes like the poet just has this kind of stream of painful memories that are just flowing forth, and therefore defy the giving this particular Kinah any kind of structure. Just the stanzas are not of a standard length. Sometimes he just goes on and on and on. This also, of course, relates to martyrdom, and sometimes in certain medieval sources, this one included in an even more painful way than the tradition of the 10 Martyrs. The 10 Martyrs, at least, if they chose martyrdom, so to speak, they did so in their highly compromised circumstances, where the choice was not really theirs at all. And yet in this case, the Jews often had something of a choice. They had a choice to convert or be killed. And sometimes they, in fact, took a third choice, which is to commit suicide or even to kill one another. This was, of course, a highly controversial, I hesitate to call it a practice, but a highly controversial kind of event. It happened in a number of communities in Europe during the Middle Ages. And the interesting and difficult thing to get our heads around is the extent to which the people who suffered martyrdom, often at their own hands or hands of their other Jews, were venerated. They were venerated as martyrs. They were venerated for not accepting conversion. This is a very hard thing for us to get our heads around in this day and age, and not necessarily something that we should buy into wholeheartedly. The best analysis of this that I've seen is by Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, who's written, among other scholars, has written about this concept of martyrdom extensively, and talks about the mindset of Jews in the Middle Ages, what it meant to be a Jew living in often very tiny communities in a sea of Christians, what it meant to feel that you were constantly defending your faith in the face of the other who regarded you as the killer of Christ, the other who regarded you as the figure who was always going to be associated with the devil, what this meant for you and your religious perspective, and then how you came to view Christianity. The idea of converting was such an anathema to them, went against the very fiber of their being, that in some sense one could say they really didn't have very much choice. To convert to Christianity meant to defy an essential, unforgivable part of yourself. And therefore, again, we don't have time to read through this, and if you do, I warn you, the imagery is very graphic. But that's where this paitan is coming from. That's the sense in which he's venerating the martyrs of this kind of event. One interesting thing before we leave it and go on to the next Kinah is the last verse, where he begins, Torah, Torah, risak v'hit palshi ba'afarim, avel yachid asilach misped tamurim. Torah, Torah, wrap yourself in sackcloth and wallow in the dust, mourn as if for an only child a bitter lament. He turns here to the Torah in the second person and asks the Torah to mourn those who died on her behalf. So first of all, this taps into the idea again of the tradition again of the 10 martyrs, who are venerated, of course, not only for being martyrs, but primarily for being great scholars. And the loss of these 10 figures to Israel is a loss of their scholarship and a loss of their leadership and a loss of their piety. The same idea is being conveyed here, in the sense that these were great scholars who were lost to history and lost to the Jewish people. Not only they were lost, but also their Torah was lost, their Torah knowledge was lost. And therefore the paitan turns to the Torah and says, Torah, why aren't you crying for them? We'll see in a few piyutim, in a few Kinot rather, that this idea of speaking to an inanimate object in the second person becomes very prominent in some of the later Kinot. Depending on when this was written, it may of course tap into one of the Kinot that we'll read later, Tzion Halo Tishali, where Rabbi Yehuda Levi turns to the land of Israel and addresses her in very similar terms. Okay, we'll go on now to the next Kinah, which is not in this packet, but rather in the additional pages. Kinah number 26, which is another Kinah that relates to Midrashim about Yirmiyahu.
Okay, so Kinah 26, now we're back at the time of the destruction of the first temple. And this Kinah is also by Kalir, and it's, we think, the closest Midrash that we know of that is similar to this Kinah is from Echa Rabbah, but as we'll see, it's different, right? The end is certainly different, and parts of it are different. So it may be that Kalir had a different Midrash in front of him that we just don't have now, or it may be that he is taking some liberties with the Midrash that we have. And this is a fascinating Midrash. It's about when the people are leaving Eretz Yisrael and they're going into captivity. So God comes to Yirmiyahu and says, I'm like a person whose son died on the day of his chuppah, his wedding. Go and cry for me. I need you to go cry for me, and I need you to go summon the avot, and I'll add the imahot, and have them cry for me as well. And so Yirmiyahu goes to the graves of the avot and imahot, and also, so he goes to Marat HaMachpelah, and he also goes to find Moshe. And interestingly, in the Midrash in Echa, God says, go to Moshe and have him cry out for me. And Yirmiyahu says, nobody knows where Moshe is buried. I can't really go there. And God says, I'll show you. And he goes, and Yirmiyahu goes and finds Moshe. And actually, in terms of Moshe, there's a really heartbreaking piece of this Kinah where Yirmiyahu goes and he gets Moshe, and they go and they see the people as they're going off into captivity to Babel. And the people see Moshe, and when they see Moshe, they think, our Redeemer has come, right? We have been saved. And they run over to Moshe, and Moshe says to them, I'm sorry, I'm not coming here to redeem you. I'm just, I am here for now, but then I'm going to have to disappear, but my Torah will stay with you. And so Yirmiyahu goes out to Moshe, but in the Midrash, he also, and in the Kinah here, goes to Abraham, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov. In the Midrash, he also tries to get each one of the letters of the alphabet to come and plead before God for the people. And with each argument that each of the forefathers and Moshe and the letters of the alphabet are making to God, God says, I I would love to redeem them, but I can't. Look what they did. Look how they violated everything that you stand for. Look how they violated everything that the Torah stands for. And so God keeps answering, right? And you see here in this Kinah, right, that's the same kind of back and forth. So Ga'u kulam bikinim, they all cried out in lament, al chasron banim, over the absent children, right? Dovavu b'kol tachanunim pnei shochen ma'onim. They prayed for mercy from the one who dwells on high. Vayah haftachat v'zacharti lahem brit rishonim. Right? Where is the promise? I will remember the covenant with the ancients. And God says, Ma'aseh lachem banai, kseirahi milfanai. What can I do for you, my children? This is my decree, right? They exchanged my honor for naught. They had no fear, no remorse. I had to turn my eyes from them. So Abraham comes and pleads, and God says, I can't. And Yitzchak comes and pleads, and God says, I can't. And then Yaakov comes and pleads, and God says, I can't. I'm just going to share my screen. Right, so God says, and then finally Moshe says, right, Ro'ena aman kafush ba'ether u'miduman, son asher b'chayki ha'aman, ich kazu b'lo zman, v'ayah habtachat kilo aman, right, the faithful shepherd uttered, ground into ash and dirtied, the sheep I nurtured in my lap are prematurely shorn. Where is the promise? Israel is not bereft. Right, and God says, Im kadam brit ayazachut krute brit. No, I'm sorry, Moshe says that. And then, okay, so those of us who know the Midrash in Eicha are ready for Rachel to come now and to plead for her children. But this Kinah is different. I don't know if Kalir just had a different Midrash that he's referencing, or he wants to bring all the Imahot into this Kinah, right? Kol b'chilea mitofefet alavaveha. The sound of Leah's wail pounds upon her heart. Rachel achotah mevaka el baneha. Her sister Rachel bemoans her children. Zilpa maka paneha, bilha mekonenet b'shtei yadeha. Zilpa slaps her face. Bilha laments with both hands. Right. So they're all asking. They're all pleading before God. And then finally, God responds to all of them. Right, and says, "I can't totally make it out. Something to be named Lemnuchatchem. Thank you. Mala kol mishalatechem. Shalachti bavela lema'anchem. Hineni mishavev galut b'nechem. Return, perfect ones, to your place of rest. I will indeed fulfill your requests. I was sent to Babylon because of you, and will return your children from exile. So here you see, by the way, God says, I was sent to Babel, right? God is also being sent into exile with God's children, and God will return with them. And I just wanted to look at the parallel Midrash very quickly. Second. Here we go. Right, so this is from Eicha Rabbah, and this is the end of the Midrash as we have it, and it's a very famous Midrash. That time Rachel leapt before the Holy One, blessed be he, and said, Master of the universe, right? So she makes an argument. Everybody else has made arguments before God, and God has rejected all of their arguments. And now Rachel comes and makes the argument, Master of the universe, it is apparent to you that Yaakov, that to you, and I'm going to say that Yaakov, your servant, loved me with an outside's love, and worked for my father for my hand for 7 years. And when those 7 years were done, and it was time to marry Yaakov, my father decided to switch my sister for me to marry my husband. This was very difficult for me when I heard of my father's plan. And I told my husband and gave him a sign so he would be able to distinguish me from my sister, so that my father could not switch us. Afterward, I regretted my actions, and I suffered my desire and had mercy on my sister that she would not become an object of ridicule. That night, they switched my sister for me, and I gave my sister all the signs that I had given to my husband, so he would think that she was Rachel. And not only that, but I hid under the bed where my sister and Yaakov were lying down, and he would ask her questions, and she would stay quiet, and I would answer for her so that he would not recognize her voice. And I acted with chesed, with loving kindness toward her. I did not act jealously toward her or allow her to be ridiculed. And if I, whom flesh and blood, dust and ashes, did not act with jealousy to my rival wife and did not allow her to be embarrassed and ridiculed, And you are the everlasting king. Why are you acting jealously toward idol worship, which has no value? You have exiled my children, and they have been killed by the sword, and the enemies have done their will to them. So immediately God hears Rachel's argument in a way that God was not able to hear the arguments of anybody else. God's mercy was aroused, and God said, for your sake, Rachel, I will return Israel to their place. As it says, right? Kol my Hashem, kol barama nishma, v'hi b'chi tamarim, Rachel mevaka avaneha, ve'ana linachem avaneha ki inyenu. Cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted. And then God says, restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares the Lord. They shall return from the enemy's land. So this is a very beautiful Midrash that Kalir does not use, right? Kalir uses a lot of the beginning of this Midrash, but does not use this end part of the Midrash. And I just wanted to take a couple seconds and talk about Rachel's argument. Like, what is it about Rachel's argument that nobody else is able to sway God? And Rachel's argument that I gave up my husband and I spared my sister from embarrassment, so too you should not act jealously, and you should spare your children. Why does this help? So I'd like to give one more of a not so inspirational message, and then maybe an inspirational message. I think what she's saying here, right, is that why was Rachel able to give up her husband for Leah? And I think when you think about it, I think she probably knew that even if she would give up, even if she would switch with Leah, the relationship between Yaakov and Rachel would survive because it was real and she had confidence in the relationship. And so she knew that even if Yaakov was going to be with Leah, right, that even so, she didn't have to worry about her relationship with Yaakov. And I'm wondering if this is the argument that she makes to God, right? She says, your people, I know that they've been worshiping idols, right? But you should feel secure in your relationship with them. There is nothing that is going to come in between you and the people, even if they, on one night they are with this idol. The relationship between you and the people is so strong, is so intact. There's no reason for you to punish them. So that's one answer. The Ba'alei Musar give a more inspirational answer, and they say that in this case, if we say that the Beit HaMikdash, I guess we say the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of baseless hatred, right? Sinat Chinam. So here, Rachel says, I acted with Ahavat Chinam. I acted with unbounded love for my sister, right? If I can act with love, we have this capacity of acting with love. The Jewish people have this capacity of acting with love. You in turn act with love toward us. And so God says, I've heard your words and I will bring them back.
The next Kinah is among the most well-known Kinot. It's part of not only the Ashkenazic Kinah tradition, but I think every Kinah tradition. And it's also one of the few Kinot that's sung. When I looked online to see different editions of how this is sung, every ethnic group has its own tune, but everybody's got a tune. We don't know for sure who the author is, although I saw that at least one scholar identifies it as Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, the biblical scholar, who's one of the most famous biblical scholars that we from the Middle Ages. Also one of the great poets of the Middle Ages, whose songs we sing on other occasions at the Shabbat table. You'll notice immediately that the Spanish style of poetry, and even the Hebrew, is a little different than we saw in Kalir. The words are easier to understand because they're more rooted in biblical Hebrew. The structure is not quite as intricate. And this is a kinah that lends itself to singing if in a very somber tune. Eshtuka de bekirbi behaloti alibi betseiti ami mitzrayim vekinim mahina leman azkira betseiti mirushalayim az yashir Moshe shir lo yinashe בצאתי ממצרים, ויקונני ירמיה ונהני בצאתי מירושלים. The structure of the Kinah is very simple. It contrasts a pair of images from the Exodus from Egypt with a pair of images from the Exodus from Jerusalem. And the images are often paired not only in terms of rhyme, but in such a way that you see the reversal of fortune. This pairing of the Exodus from Egypt and the Exodus from Jerusalem is one that's echoed in a number of Midrashic traditions, and is really fairly straightforward and fairly obvious. From the pinnacle of God's intervention in history for our benefit, we come to the pinnacle of God's intervention for our detriment. And again, if we think about Pesach as an almost antithetical experience to Tisha B'Av, or what would in a normal year be an antithetical experience to Tisha B'Av, I have often said in past years, and it strikes me every year again when I see this Kinah, on Pesach we have one narrative, we have one Haggadah, we have one story. Each of us can elaborate on the Haggadah in our own ways, but there's one text. When we talk about the tragedies of Jewish history, every text stands on its own. There's no master narrative. There's no one way of telling the story. In victory, there is one narrative, and in defeat, every narrative stands on its own. Nothing will suffice in terms of a master narrative to capture the pain and sorrow and suffering of every generation of Jews in every Jewish community that has experienced this kind of hardship. Some of the imagery here is just worth noting. For example, in the fourth stanza, Dagan Shamayim u'mitzur mayim, in the wilderness, God provides us miraculously with food where there's no food. And then in the Exodus from Jerusalem, La'ana u'marim u'mayim u'marim, bitter grass and wormwood and bitter waters, where we had food in Jerusalem, and now all of a sudden there was none and we all went hungry. And again, Chagim v'Shabbatot, Muftim v'Otot, festivals and Sabbaths and signs and wonder, B'tzitim Mitzrayim, when I left Egypt, Tanit v'Evel U'Redof HaHevel, fasted, mourning, and vain pursuits when I left Jerusalem. The contrast, the very bitter contrast, of course, between the experience of the festival to mark a historical occasion and the experience of fasting. I do want to move on though, because time is running shorter than we expected, as usual. To what is always a highlight of the Kinot, and I think especially this year, a Kinah that speaks to our experience right now. This is, of course, written by Yehuda Halevi. It's among the most famous Kinot. It has essentially created an entire new genre of Kinah, the Kinah of Longing. And following this Kinah in the standard Kinot, if you look, for example, on Sefaria, all the Kinot that follow this, all of them are copies of this. All of them are riffing on the themes and structure and images that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi generates in this Kinah. It essentially becomes an entire new subcategory of Kinot. Zion, surely you will inquire after the well-being of your imprisoned ones, those who seek your well-being and remnant of your flock. Yehuda Halevi, of course, is famous for many things, including the book, the Kuzari, which is one of the most important works in medieval Jewish philosophy. He's also famous for his poems, one of which is Libi b'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east and I am at the ends of the west. Yehuda Halevi longs for Israel here with an intensity that this poem can barely contain. He wants to be in Israel, he wants to travel Israel, he wants to feel Israel's rocks, he wants to breathe Israel's air. There's an intensely personal dimension to this poem that is matched only by the second person who appears at the end of every single line, which is, of course, the land of Israel. So it's not only about his experience as somebody who's suffering, somebody who's longing, but it tells us just as much, if not more, about the object of his longing, which is Eretz Yisrael, who he addresses here, not as an object in the third person, but as his beloved in the second person. Every line of the poem ends with the suffix ayich, which means yours, v'hem adarayich, the remnant of your flock. Miyam mizrach mitzafon v'teman shlom rachok v'karov se'i mikol avarayich. From west, east, north, and south, promote the well-being of the distant and close, of your distant and close from every direction. The translation doesn't always preserve that element. I'm not such a fan of this particular translation. There have, of course, been many translations, many copies, and many scholarly treatments of this, and I feel bad that in the time that we have to look at this, we're not really going to do it justice. But it's so important as a poem, not only as a Kinah on Tisha B'Av, that it has had significant impact even on modern Hebrew. If you read through it on your own, you will notice, of course, the line that Naomi Shemer picked from here for her song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, where Yehuda Halevi says, and of course now I'm not going to be able to find it, where he says, yeah, I'm not going to be able to find it. Ani kinor l'shiraich. I am a harp for all of your songs. The Hebrew here is, of course, similar to what we just read before, coming out of the same Spanish tradition. It's more simpler, it's more simple and more biblical in its tone. There's a lot of biblical imagery here. And again, there's a much less intricate structure, if a structure at all. There's rhythm, there's rhyme, but not much else. The kind of images tumbling out of Yehuda Levi's mouth, one after the other, creates a sense of stream of consciousness, which is really the point, because what Yehuda Levi is guiding us on here is a mental journey, a kind of dream journey from Spain, where he lives most of his life, to the land of Israel, where eventually he travels and ends his life. He travels across space, he travels as well across time. Beginning, of course, with the verse that we saw, across space, miyam mizrach mitzafon miteiman, you should look after those who seek you, your flocks in all four directions. And then later on in the poem, he says, Mi tineni mishortet b'makomot asher niglu Elohim l'chozayich v'tzirayich, mi asadi chnafayim v'archik nedod anid vitrei levavi bein b'tarayich. Would that I would wander among the places where God was revealed to your seers and envoys. Who can make wings for me so that I can roam from afar and move my ruptured heart to your ruptured hills? And then moving on later in a slightly more realistic tone. I will fall my face in your land. Oh, sorry, not here. I wanted to... Yeah, he travels all around. I will fall my face in your land and treasure your stones and cherish your soil. He travels to Hebron, to the graves of the forefathers and foremothers. You get the sense here that if this could be filmed nowadays, you would have kind of this, this like panoramic helicopter ride across Israel, where he goes to Hebron, then he goes to the Carmel, and he goes to the Gilad. He's interested in every part of Israel, its holy places, its grave sites, its natural wonders. He's in awe of it all. And then he continues on in imagery that is a little different, but has the same wondrous tone. It will be pleasant for me to walk naked and barefoot upon the desolate ruins that were once your shrines. In the place of your ark now buried, in the place of your cherubs who once dwelled in your innermost chambers. So he loves Eretz Yisrael, but which Eretz Yisrael does he love? Does he love the Eretz Yisrael of the present, of the past, of the future? Aside from the dimension of space, which is telescoped here as he speaks from Spain about the wonders of Eretz Yisrael and all of Eretz Yisrael at once, there's really a sense that time is telescoped here as well. He merges past, present, and future all into this one jumbled narrative, where on the one hand, here he is in the land of Israel, or imagining himself in the land of Israel, but he's really in the past, and he's in the present, but he's also living in the glorious past that is no longer. The past where God's presence was felt, where God's Shekhinah, his divine presence, was a reality, and now there's nothing left. And therefore, as he walks in Israel, as much as he loves Israel, he's walking naked and barefoot, because he's in mourning, because Israel is so desolate, and therefore he is so desolate. The merging of past, present, and future here is really very striking in a number of different parts of the poem, only a few of which we'll have a chance to see. For example, towards the end of the poem, Zion Kalilat Yofi Ahava V'chein Tikshiri Me'az, Zion perfectly beautiful with love and grace. You were bound long ago. Ubach niksharu nafshot chaverayich, and bound to you are the souls of your comrades. So we have an image of Israel as beautiful, as magnificent. Heim asmechim l'shalvatecha koavim al shamamuteich ubochim al shivarayich. Those are the ones who rejoice in your tranquility, and who are anguished by your ruin, and who weep for your tragedy. Well, is Israel tranquil, or is it anguished? It is at the same time, because all of Jewish history here is being telescoped into this one dreamscape, this one merging of many different places and times that all kind of get jumbled together. One commentator that I saw, an essayist by the name of Natana Lifshitz, tied in here the idea elaborated on by Michel Foucault of heterotopia, other spaces. And Foucault talks about other spaces in many different social senses. But one of them is the sense of other space as a holy space. And Foucault notes that when we talk about holy spaces often involve a distortion of time in exactly the way that we find here in Yehuda Halevi's poem. When you enter into holy space, you leave the normal time stream of the rest of the world. Somehow you step outside of time and you find yourself in another kind of reality. And that's where that's the reality that Yehuda Halevi is drawing us into in this poem. This poem speaks to me the most on this particular Tisha B'Av, aside from being very beautiful and very poignant, because really it's about longing. There are many different themes that Tisha B'Av draws out and makes us think about. But longing is one that I think we feel particularly powerfully this year. What does it mean to long for something? It means to mourn and not to be able to let go. It means to realize that there's something you want that's just beyond your grasp, something that you had, something that you lost, and something that you hope to regain, but you just don't know when. And therefore, when we find ourselves closed in our houses or in our communities, wondering when we'll be able to go out again, when we'll be able to live a normal life again, when we feel ourselves far away from family members, far away from people and places that we love, this is a poem that speaks very tenderly to the experience that we're having this year. One can imagine this poem being written by somebody in the far West, longing for Israel, and for the first time in modern memory, not being able to simply get on a plane and go there. Would that you would build wings for me, cries Yehuda Halevi in the 10th century, in the 11th century, and now we know exactly how he feels. The next Kinah, as we move towards the end of our discussion of Kinot, is another one of my favorites. Again, not because it's less tragic. In fact, I think it's in many ways more tragic and more raw than Yehuda Halevi, but because it builds on the tradition of Kinot that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi establishes in a very creative way, and in a very different way than all the other Kinot we've read. Inquire, you are consumed in fire, after the well-being of your mourners who so strongly desire to reside in your dwellings. Like Yehuda Halevi, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, this Kinah, which will this Mekonein, this author who we'll identify in a minute, is speaking to an inanimate object in the second person and saying, won't you inquire about those who love you and those who desire you? But the inanimate object here is not the land of Israel, but rather she who has been consumed in fire, namely the Talmud. This poem is written, as you can see in the introduction here, by Maharam of Rothenburg, one of the towering scholars in Germany in the 13th century, and whose imprisonment and death, towards the imprisonment the last 12 years of his life and ultimately his death, mark the end of the flowering of Torah scholarship in Germany for many years afterwards. Maharam Rothenburg was the student of Rabbi Paris, the scholar who was engaged in the disputation or the trial of the Talmud in Paris in the year 1240. This was the result of a confluence of different factors. We have a great deal of information about the trial of the Talmud, though not any first-person records that would give us a sense of what actually transpired. We imagine the disputation in Paris as being similar to disputations that happened elsewhere during the Middle Ages, but in fact it seems that it was really more of a trial, and Rabbi Paris, who was one of the key figures involved on the Jewish side, rather than having the chance to face his interlocutors, was probably imprisoned during the time that he was that he was asked to defend the Talmud, and not given a great deal of freedom at all. The Maharam was his student and was most likely a first-person witness to what happened during the trial of the Talmud and the aftermath in 1242, when, even before the verdict of the trial had been given, 24 carts of Talmuds were taken into the public square in Paris and burned. He was still a very young man at this point. As you can see, he was born in 1215, and the burning of the Talmud took place in 1242. One can only imagine the impact that it had on his life and how tragic he felt that it was. On the one hand, you think of books as an inanimate object, certainly less tragic than the losses of life of communities that we've been talking about up until this point in the Kinot. And yet, if you've ever been a scholar, if you're looking for one girsa, one variant, textual variant that would help you solve a particularly knotty problem in a Talmudic sugya, if you've ever been somebody who doesn't have access to a Talmud, then you understand what the loss of a book is. And kal v'chomer, what the loss of 24 carts full of Talmuds are for our reception of this very important document from this very pivotal period during its history. I used to bring my students, I've told this story on a number of occasions, and that somebody will remind me that I've told it in past years. But I took my students on a number of occasions to the library at JTS to see the rare book room. And every book is handled with gloves as a relic, because that's what it is. They have, for example, an autographed copy of the Mishneh Torah, of the Rambam's magnum opus, which was reviewed and signed by Maimonides himself. And you're just kind of in awe that this book was handled by Maimonides. What would we give for the many books that were destroyed here and elsewhere in Jewish history? The Maharam writes this Kinah to the Talmud and speaks to it in the second person. And as we saw before with the other Kinah that we read commemorating the massacres of the Middle Ages, this one is very raw and very personal. And what we find here towards the end of the Kinah especially is a sense of loss about the tradition that's being lost, not only the object of the Talmud itself, the book of the Talmud, and its abuse at the hands of the Christians the Christian authorities who burned them, but also the loss of the voices that have been lost to tradition when these books have been destroyed. He says here, "Vani kishalchu v'galmud nisharti levad mehen k'torin berosh har migiladayich lo eshma'u l'kol sharim v'sharot alai ki nitku mitarei tupecha ilayich." And I, beloved and forlorn, remained alone without them like a mast atop the mountains of your towers. No longer will I listen to the voices of your singers, for severed are the strings of your timbrels and flutes. There's a sense here that the Maharam feels that he's been cut off from a tradition and that tradition has been forever lost to history. Similar to what we read before, that he mourned not only the loss of life, but also the loss of Torah scholarship and leadership. The Maharam reflects a similar sentiment here as he's mourning the loss of these physical books. As we approach the end of our time together, we have to, of course, acknowledge the greatest tragedy in terms of scope and scale of Jewish history, which is, of course, the Holocaust. A number of different Kinot have been written about the Holocaust. There's one that has become particularly prominent in Israel, which is based on the last Kinah that we'll sing together, Elit Zion. This one was written by Rav Shimon Schwab, who himself was from Germany and emigrated to the United States with his community in the early 20th century. This is, of course, the German community in Washington Heights. So Shimon Schwab was again engaged in an act of personal mourning when he penned this Kinah. Hazocher mazkirav dor dor ukdoshav meit asher az becharatnu yizkor deraon shel dor acharon oya mehaya lanu shtufei mabudam shmasru nafshotam kol shkuei im kehabacha yifkedeim Elohim be'artot ha'chaim v'adei ad zichram livracha. He uses, of course, a lot of the imagery that we've seen in other Kinot, a similar structure, albeit one that I think is more typical, not of the Kinot, but of the Slichot that we'll start reading in a number of weeks. It's hard to say how a Kinah should be judged when we are still so close to the time of the tragedy. Writing poetry, I think, benefits from a certain degree of historical distance, which of course we do not have the benefit of, and it's hard to know even as we have so many testaments to and memorials to the Holocaust. Poetry is one that I think is still waiting to be written, even though we have a number of Kinot that do the job as well as we can. He too, of course, mourns not only the terrible, terrible loss of life, but also the loss of Torah, the loss of Torah scholarship. Vel sarei Torah machzikim sara vel pirchei kehuna tzirim vel chovshei midrashot marim marot tinokot beit Rabbanit karim. For the prince of Torah, pillars of tradition, the flower of priestly youth, the scholars, the teachers, men and women, for the precious young in the houses of study. I forget where I heard the statistic that in Warsaw in the late 1930s, in 1 year, there were more books of Torah published than at any other point ever in Jewish history since, or up until that point, or maybe even since. Just the sense of the richness of Jewish life in Europe that was lost is still staggering, and it's still hard for us to put into words. And we're grateful for the words that we have. But unfortunately, I want to push on because we're running out of time, and I want to get to the last Kinah that we have that I want to say together. The last Kinah, which ends the recitation of Kinot in, again, I think all Kinot traditions, is Elit Zion. And maybe we'll sing together a few verses because this one is always sung. And the tune is a tune that's that's fairly well known and sung all over. Elit Zion is picks up on imagery that's found in Eicha and also a number of other Kinot where Zion, the image of Zion, is depicted as a woman. And the feminine imagery here is refracted in an interesting way. Elit Zion ve'areha kamo isha betzireha, lament Zion in her cities like a woman in labor pains. This is an image that's found, I think, not in Eicha, but in the other prophetic writings, where Israel, the feminine image of Israel, is compared to a woman in labor, of course, undergoing a great deal of suffering, but of course, there's hope at the end. Like a maiden girl in her girt in her sackcloth for the husband of her youth. The other feminine image here is of a young bride who's mourning the husband who she barely had known. So we have these two images, the one of a woman in childbirth where the outcome is yet unknown. I think we're too confident in our sense that that labor necessarily yields a positive outcome given the prevalence of death during childbirth in a pre-modern era. But the other image of a woman who has no hope, who has lost the husband of her youth and will forever be in mourning. So these two images paired together give us a sense of the two halves of Tisha B'Av, the one that we said last night, which is unmitigated suffering and unbridled mourning, and the one that we're about to enter into now as we approach Chatzot, the half point of the day, at least in the United States, where we take a more hopeful turn and think, even though that we are suffering, that there is hope, there's light at the end of the tunnel, that we can see maybe a glimmer of redemption. So we'll sing at least a few verses together. Maybe try to sing the whole thing. I will sing and you can join in. Unfortunately, Zoom does not allow us to sing together, as I said, without a great deal of dissonance. But we'll sing this together and this will end our recitation of Kinot. Eli Tzion v'yadeha kemo isha b'tzideha v'chivetu lach agudatzak ala ba'ala neuedeha alei armon asher lutash v'ashmatzon adadeha v'ala bihat mecharfela בתוך מקדש חדריה, עלי הגלות משרתל, מנים שיר זמניה, ועל הדמם אשר שופך, כמו מימי יהודיה, עלי הגיון מחוליה, אשר דמם בעדיה, והלבד אשר שמים וביטול הסנהדריה עלי זבחי תמידיה ופדיוניה בחודיה והלחילו לכלי היכל והמזבח כתודיה עלי טפי מלאכיה בני דוד גביניה, ועל יופיים אשר חשך, ויצרו כתדיה, עלי כבוד אשר גלה, וית חורבן דודיה, ועל לוחץ אשר לחץ, ושם סכין בחגודיה, עלי מחץ ורוב מכות, אשר הוכו נזידיה, ועל ניפוץ אלי סלע, עולליה נעדיה, עלי שמחת אויביה, וסך כמל שבדיה, ועל עינוי בני חורין, נדיביה תהוניה, עלי פשע אשר עבתה, סלול דרך שודיה, ועל צבאות קהליה, שזופיה שחוריה, עלי קולות מחרפיה, בית רבו פגדיה, ועל נגשת מגדפיה, בתוך משכן חצריה, עלי שמך אשר חולל, בפי קמי מצריה, ועל התחן יצבחו לך, כשוש מעמדיה, אלי ציון וידיה, כמו אישה בצידיה, וחיבתו לך אגודצק, על הבעל נעודיה. For those who want to go back to some of the Kinot that we've said together and examine them in more detail, I think you have access to the Kinot file in the chat box. It's also available if you Google current Kinah excerpt online. You'll find it. And as I said, it's available for free download. I hope you'll join us this afternoon for a series of lectures starting in about an hour, starting with Professor Nathaniel Berman. I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and I hope this contributed to your Tisha B'Av.
Thank you, Rabbi Reifman. Thank you, Rabbanit Sperling. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on what Rabbi Reifman was mentioning in terms of our upcoming classes this afternoon. At 1 o'clock, we have, as Rabbi Reifman said, a class with Dr. Nathaniel Berman, The Impossibility of Mourning, Zoharic Thoughts on 2 Millennia and Counting of Tisha B'Av. At 2:30, we will be learning with Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz on suffering and metaphors, limits and opportunities. At 4 o'clock, we have 2 different sessions. We have one with Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belzer, God Who Suffers with Divine Presence Amidst Pain, as well as a session that is open to young women in high school, led by Shira Hecht-Kohler, The Poetics of Destruction, Text Study, and Interactive Workshop. So feel free to register for any of those on our website. I will put a link in the chat right now for you to go get more information about any of those programs. You can also follow us on Facebook Live. If you're watching there, all of those will be live streamed. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to Rabbi Reifman and Rabbanit Sperling, and a meaningful rest of the day to all.